How was it possible to preserve food in a world without refrigeration, without modern packaging, and without any scientific knowledge of bacteria? 2,000 years ago, in the time of Jesus, a family's survival depended not just on producing food, but on their ability to stop it from rotting. Spoilage was a race against the clock. The climate of Judea and Galilee is predominantly hot and dry for much of the year. In the summer, soaring temperatures could drastically accelerate the decay of meat, fish, and fruit. Even grains, if stored with even a hint of moisture, could develop mold or attract pests. Preserving food wasn't a secondary chore. It was an essential stage of the agricultural cycle. Production began in the fields, but the true test came after the harvest. Wheat and barley, the region's main cereals, had to be carefully dried before storage. After harvesting, the sheaves were left out in the sun. Solar exposure reduced the internal moisture of the grains, lowering the risk of mold. Archaeological excavations in the Galilee region reveal underground silos carved directly into the limestone bedrock. These silos featured narrow openings that opened up into wider chambers below the surface. This design wasn't random. Underground environments maintained a stable temperature, protecting the cache from extreme heat variations. Thermal stability was a primitive, yet highly efficient form of environmental control. Beyond silos, large ceramic jars were used to store grains and liquids. Some of these vessels had lids sealed with clay. This sealing kept insects out and limited air circulation. Without understanding microorganisms, ancient communities understood empirically that heat, moisture, and excessive air accelerated spoilage. Preservation was based on three practical principles: dry, seal, and protect. But grains were only part of the challenge. Fish presented a much more urgent problem. In the Sea of Galilee region, fishing was a significant economic activity. However, fresh fish goes bad rapidly in hot climates. Without immediate preservation, it became unfit for consumption in a matter of hours. The most common solution was the intensive use of salt. Salt from the Dead Sea and other nearby regions was abundant and highly valued. It played an essential role in conservation. By covering the fish in salt, moisture was extracted through osmosis. This process drastically reduced bacterial activity. After salting, many fish were also dried in the sun. The result was a product that was lighter, durable, and transportable. This method allowed food to travel to villages far from the coast. Preservation didn't just extend the shelf life of the food, it expanded its commercial reach. Fruits followed a similar logic. Figs, dates, and grapes were staples of the regional diet. However, their availability was seasonal. To ensure a supply during periods of scarcity, dehydration was widely used. Figs were split open and exposed to the sun. Grapes were transformed into raisins. Dates could be pressed to form compact blocks. Removing water was fundamental. Moisture favors the growth of microorganisms. By eliminating it, the food became shelf-stable for much longer periods. This knowledge wasn't theoretical. It was the result of generations of trial and error. Another important element was olive oil. Beyond its culinary use, olive oil could act as a sealing agent. Certain foods, stored submerged in oil, were less exposed to the air, which slowed down deterioration. Wine also represented an indirect form of preservation. Fresh grape juice ferments naturally. Fermentation produces alcohol, which acts as a natural preservative. Once transformed into wine, the liquid became much more stable than the original juice. Storage in sealed ceramic amphorae helped protect the contents from external contamination. Every method of preservation had limits. None were permanent, but all of them significantly extended the window for consumption. This extension of time was vital. The region's agricultural calendar included periods of abundance and periods of scarcity. The ability to conserve food determined a family's stability throughout the year. Beyond natural threats, there were social and political pressures. Tributes to the Roman Empire demanded a share of agricultural production. This reduced available reserves. Therefore, correctly preserving what was left became even more crucial. Losing stored food wasn't just waste, it was a real risk of starvation. This context helps us understand the economic mindset of the era. Society lived in a constant balance between production and loss. Nothing was discarded easily. This world, highly dependent on preservation techniques, shaped social and religious practices. When biblical texts mention salt, leaven, or storage, these references carry concrete weight. They aren't just abstract metaphors, they are elements of daily life. Before we can understand the symbolic meaning of these images, we need to understand their material basis. In the next segment, we will dive deeper into specific conservation methods, analyzing salting, fermentation, drying, and underground storage in more detail, and understand how these processes structured the domestic economy of the first century. Because preserving food wasn't just a culinary issue, it was a survival strategy in a world where deterioration was constant. In the previous segment, we saw that preserving food wasn't a minor domestic detail in Jesus' time. It was a survival imperative. Spoilage was fast, the climate was demanding, and reserves were limited. Now, we need to understand more precisely what methods were used and why they worked.
First-century food conservation relied on simple, physical principles, even if they weren't scientifically formulated at the time. Remove moisture, limit contact with air, and create environments hostile to decomposition. The most widespread and strategic method was salting. Salt possessed both economic and functional value. The Dead Sea region contained abundant natural deposits. Blocks of salt were extracted and traded. The substance was used for both seasoning and preservation.
The salting process followed a practical logic. The food, mainly fish or meat, was cleaned and covered generously with salt. The salt penetrated the tissues and drew out water through osmosis. Water is essential for the proliferation of microorganisms. By reducing it drastically, the environment became unsuitable for most agents of decay. In the case of fish, the sequence was clear: catch, immediate gutting, basic washing, and intense application of salt. Often, after salting, the fish was exposed to the sun for days. The combination of dehydration and salinity significantly increased its durability. Archaeological evidences in the Galilee region suggest the existence of processing centers for salted fish. This product wasn't just for local consumption, it was a tradable commodity. Conservation expanded the geographic reach of food. A catch made on the shores of the lake could feed communities miles away. Meat followed a similar logic, although it was less common in daily consumption. Animals like goats and sheep were more valued for milk, wool, and reproduction. Slaughter was occasional. When it happened, preservation had to be immediate. Without refrigeration, fresh meat could only be consumed quickly. Salting made it possible to extend its use. In some cases, meat could also be hung to air dry in protected environments, further reducing moisture. Another central method was solar dehydration. The Levant region has dry, sunny summers. This climate favored natural drying. Fruits like figs and grapes were cut or spread over vegetable fiber surfaces. Prolonged exposure to the sun removed much of the internal water. The transformation of grapes into raisins is a classic example. The concentrated sugar content and low humidity resulted in a high-energy, durable food. Dried figs could be stored for months if protected from moisture. This method required vigilance. Dust, insects, and animals represented risks. Therefore, the process wasn't simply leaving it in the sun. It involved supervision, turning the fruits periodically and gathering them at the right moment. Time management was essential. Beyond drying and salting, fermentation played a fundamental role. Fermentation is a controlled biological transformation. Although first-century inhabitants didn't understand microbiological mechanisms, they knew how to recognize their effects. Wine is the most evident example. Fresh grape juice is highly perishable. However, when fermented, it transforms into a stable beverage. The alcohol produced acts as a natural preservative. The process involved crushing grapes in stone presses. The must, juice, was transferred to vessels where it fermented through the natural action of yeast present on the skins. After the initial period, the liquid was stored in sealed amphorae. These amphorae were made of porous ceramic, but were frequently lined internally with vegetable resins. This lining limited oxidation and contamination. The result was a product that could last for months or years if stored correctly. Dairy products also depended on transformation for conservation. Fresh milk spoils quickly in hot weather. Because of this, it was common to transform it into derivatives like cheese and yogurt. Lactic fermentation alters the chemical environment of the milk, making it less favorable to decomposition. Simple cheeses, made from goat or sheep milk, could be consumed fresh or lightly cured. The reduction of moisture increased their stability. Another frequently overlooked element is underground storage. As mentioned earlier, silos dug into rock and compartments below ground level created thermally stable environments. Subterranean temperature suffers less daily variation. This stability slows down the acceleration of chemical and biological processes responsible for spoilage. Some warehouses were built with thick stone walls, limiting exposure to external heat. Architecture was an integral part of the preservation strategy. Olive oil also had a relevant function in this context. Besides being food and fuel for lamps, olive oil could serve as a protective layer. Certain foods stored under a layer of oil were less exposed to air. This technique reduced oxidation and limited contact with microorganisms. Grains stored in jars were inspected periodically. Moisture could be reintroduced by leaks. Constant vigilance was part of the domestic routine. Conservation, therefore, wasn't an isolated event. It was a continuous process. Each method had limitations. Drying depended on favorable weather. Salting required access to salt. Fermentation could fail. Underground storage didn't totally eliminate the risk of pests. Yet combined, these methods created a safety net. Annual survival depended on this net. The agricultural calendar of the 1st century included harvests concentrated in specific periods. After the harvest came the critical phase of processing and storage. Errors at this stage compromised months of work. It is important to highlight that preservation wasn't just an individual technique, it was community knowledge. Families transmitted practices to their children. Past mistakes became collective learning. The knowledge was empirical, but refined. This scenario helps to understand the economic mentality of the period. There was no abundant surplus to waste. The margin between stability and scarcity was narrow. Conservation widened that margin. It created time. Time until the next harvest. Time until the next catch. Time until the next favorable season. And time in that context meant life. But there is an even deeper aspect that needs to be considered. These methods didn't just sustain bodies. They shaped language, symbols, and cultural perceptions. When a 1st century Jewish teacher spoke about salt losing its value, about leaven transforming the whole dough, or about new wine in old wineskins, he was using images drawn directly from this technical universe. To fully understand these metaphors, it is necessary to first understand their material basis. In the next segment, we will analyze how food conservation impacted the domestic economy, social organization, and even the religious structures of the time. Because preserving food wasn't just keeping food edible, it was structuring an entire life around the prevention of loss. So far, we've seen the methods: salting, drying, fermentation, underground storage, milk transformation, the use of olive oil, architecture adapted to the climate. Now we need to answer an essential question. How did these practices shape social structure in the time of Jesus? Because preserving food wasn't just a domestic skill. It was a determining factor in economic stability and community hierarchy. In the 1st century, the majority of the population in Judea and Galilee lived in a subsistence economy. This means they basically produced what they consumed. The surplus margin was small, in many cases almost non-existent. When the harvest was good, the priority wasn't immediate consumption. It was strategic preservation. Families had to carefully calculate how much grain to keep for the next sowing, how much to reserve for consumption, and how much could be used for trade or tax payments. The Roman Empire demanded taxes. Part of the agricultural production was collected as tribute. This further reduced available reserves. In this scenario, losing stored food meant entering a danger zone. Conservation increased predictability, and predictability was synonymous with stability. A family that better mastered storage techniques had a higher probability of getting through periods of scarcity. This directly impacted their relative economic position within the village. We aren't talking about abundant wealth, but about security. Food security generated autonomy. Autonomy reduced vulnerability. In contrast, families that faced frequent losses became dependent on loans, disadvantageous trades, or community aid. Conservation, therefore, had social implications. It influenced networks of dependency. It shaped power relations. Another important factor was seasonality. Agricultural production was concentrated in specific times of the year. Storage allowed consumption to be spread out over months. Without this, temporary abundance would be followed by severe scarcity. This logic also influenced regional trade. Preserved products could circulate between villages. Salted fish could reach inland regions. Dried figs could be transported with relative ease. Wine stored in amphorae could be traded over longer distances. Preservation made the market possible. Without conservation, the food trade would be drastically limited by spoilage time. Another relevant point is the role of women in this system. Agricultural production frequently involved men in the fields, but the transformation and conservation of food occurred largely in the domestic environment. Drying fruits, supervising fermentations, storing grains, making cheese. These activities required experience and constant attention. The household's food security depended on this daily management. Therefore, conservation also structured the internal functioning of the family. It was invisible work, but central. Beyond the domestic economy, there is the community dimension. In periods of drought or failed harvests, communities could turn to stored reserves. Larger silos, belonging to landowners or collective structures, could serve as an emergency source. But this dynamic also created inequality. Those who controlled larger stocks controlled essential resources. In a world without institutional social safety nets, access to preserved food determined power. Now observe how this scenario helps us understand certain biblical narratives. Parables involving barns, accumulated grain, or scarcity don't appear by chance. They reflect a world where storing correctly meant future survival. When someone decides to build larger barns to store their harvest, this isn't just a spiritual metaphor, it is a concrete economic practice. Storage was a sign of prudence, but it could also be a sign of excessive hoarding. This ambiguity is important because preserving food had two sides. On one hand, it guaranteed life. On the other, it could generate a concentration of resources. In small communities, the circulation of preserved food also strengthened bonds. Offering wine, dried figs, or salted fish at a meal meant sharing part of the reserve. And sharing reserves was a significant gesture. It wasn't about disposable abundance. It was about dividing future security. This gives new weight to hospitality. Receiving someone at the table involved consuming preserved resources that might be needed weeks later. Conservation, therefore, was connected to ethics. Deciding when to use reserves was a moral and strategic decision. Furthermore, the region's climatic instability reinforced the importance of storage. Periodic droughts affected harvests. Irregular rains compromised plantings. Pests could destroy part of the production. In such an environment, society developed a mindset of anticipation. Planning was indispensable, and planning required discipline. This discipline shaped the annual rhythm of life. After the harvest came an intense period of processing. Drying, salting, storing, sealing. It wasn't a time for rest. It was a critical phase. Survival through the winter depended on this step. Now consider another element, ritual purity. Certain foods couldn't be consumed under specific conditions. Preparation and storage needed to respect the norms of Jewish law. Meat required adequate removal of blood. Vessels could become ritually impure depending on contact. Therefore, conservation wasn't just a physical technique, it also involved religious conformity. Storing correctly meant staying within the norms of the covenant. This integrates preservation into spiritual identity. In summary, preserving food in Jesus' time affected the domestic economy, annual stability, social relations, community hierarchy, regional trade, religious practice. It wasn't just a culinary technique. It was the infrastructure of daily life. In the next segment, we will explore how this material reality directly influenced the symbolic language used in the Gospels, especially the images of salt, leaven, and wine. Because when these words were spoken, they weren't abstract concepts. They were references to concrete processes that everyone knew deeply. So far, we have analyzed the methods and social impacts of food conservation in the first century. Now we need to understand something essential: how this material reality shaped the language and religious thought of the era. Because in the world of Jesus' time, metaphors didn't spring from the abstract. They were born from concrete experience, and few experiences were as universal as preserving food. Let's start with salt. We've already seen that salt was a strategic element. It preserved fish and meat. It extracted moisture. It retarded decomposition. It was a valuable commodity. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus states, "You are the salt of the earth." To a modern audience, This might sound like a generic compliment, but to a first-century audience, the meaning was precise. Salt was the thing that stopped deterioration. In a society where rot was a constant threat, to preserve meant to protect from corruption. When Jesus uses this image, he isn't just referring to flavor, he is invoking a vital function. Salt that loses its capacity to preserve becomes useless. This statement had concrete weight. Another example is leaven, yeast. In daily life, leaven transformed simple dough into risen bread. A small amount altered the entire composition. It was a known process, observed daily in homes. Jesus uses leaven in both positive and negative ways. He speaks of the leaven of the kingdom, which grows silently. He also speaks of the leaven of the Pharisees, as an influence that spreads. The metaphor works because everyone knew how leaven acted: invisible, progressive, transformative. Without understanding microbiology, they knew the effect. And then, there is wine. Fermentation of must wasn't a rare phenomenon. It was an annual practice in grape-producing regions. Storing wine required adequate vessels. Old wineskins could burst under the pressure of fermentation. When Jesus speaks about new wine into new wineskins, he is describing a technical reality. An aged container loses elasticity. The gas produced by fermentation generates pressure. If the wineskin doesn't support expansion, it ruptures. This image isn't a distant allegory. It is a practical observation of rural life. Religious language is born from daily technique. Another significant element is bread. Bread only existed because the grain was preserved correctly after the harvest. Without adequate storage, there would be no flour months later. When the prayer taught to the disciples asks for our daily bread, it carries a real dependence on the complete cycle. Planting, harvesting, drying, storage, milling, and baking. Conservation was implied. Without preservation, the request would be impossible. There are also references to barns. In parables that mention storing harvests, the image is familiar to the original audience. Barns weren't a symbol of modern luxury, but critical structures for annual security. Storing was prudent, but accumulating excessively while others went without raised an ethical question. Thus, conservation appears as a point of moral tension. Preserving was necessary, but preserving exclusively for oneself could generate inequality. Another relevant point is purity. Certain conservation practices had to respect Jewish law standards. Blood had to be drained adequately. Certain containers could become impure depending on use. This means that preserving food wasn't just a physical technique, it was also a religious practice. Correct storage was linked to obedience. So when texts speak of purity, impurity, or contamination, they aren't just dealing with abstract spiritual concepts. They are engaging with a reality where literal contamination meant a risk to health and religious identity. Understanding this material basis prevents us from reading the Gospels out of context. The images used aren't poetic in the modern sense, they are functional. When Jesus multiplies loaves and fish, we are talking about basic, preservable foods. Salted fish and bread were common components of the diet. When he participates in meals, what is on the table are products that have gone through the conservation processes we've analyzed: fermented wine, stored olive oil, preserved grains. This reinforces a central point. First-century spirituality was integrated into material life. There was no radical separation between the daily grind and faith. Food conservation was an economic, domestic, and religious activity all at once. Furthermore, the mindset of constant vigilance against deterioration influenced moral perception. Just as food could corrupt, so could conduct. Just as salt stopped decomposition, faithfulness preserved the community. These analogies worked because they were based on daily experience. For the original listener, these words required no technical explanation. They were part of the routine. Now, it is important to avoid romanticization. The world of the first century was vulnerable. Conservation didn't eliminate risks, it only reduced them. Mistakes happened. Stocks could be contaminated. Prolonged drought could exhaust reserves. Taxes could consume a significant part of production. Precariousness remained. And this precariousness shaped spiritual dependence. When biblical texts speak about trusting in divine provision, this emerges from a context where failures in conservation could result in real famine. It isn't a distant metaphor. It is about concrete life. In the next and final segment, we will integrate everything we have seen: methods, social impact, and symbolic language. to understand what food conservation reveals about the world in which Jesus lived and taught. Because understanding how they preserved food brings us closer to the historical reality of the Gospels. And this alters the way we read these narratives today. Throughout this documentary, we have traveled a path that begins in matter and ends in historical understanding. We analyze the methods: sun-drying, salting, fermentation, underground storage, the use of olive oil, the transformation of milk. We observed how each technique extended the life of food in an environment marked by intense heat, seasonality, and instability. Then we understood that food conservation wasn't just a technical issue. It was an economic factor. It was an element of social stability. It was a mechanism of collective survival. Now we can answer the central question of this documentary. What was the true secret of preserving food 2,000 years ago, in the time of Jesus? The secret wasn't in a single, isolated technique. It was in the combination of three fundamental principles: control of moisture, control of air, control of time, removing water through drying and salting, limiting oxidation with sealing and proper storage, extending durability through fermentation. But there is something even deeper. The true secret was mindset. A mindset built on anticipation, discipline, and responsibility. Nothing was done impromptu. Nothing was stored without planning. Nothing was wasted without consequence. Conservation required constant vigilance. And this vigilance shaped how people perceived the world. In an environment where deterioration was inevitable, preserving meant fighting against loss. This influenced the economy, family organization, trade, and even spirituality. When we read the Gospels in light of this reality, certain expressions gain concrete historical weight. Salt of the earth ceases to be a vague symbolic phrase and comes to represent the vital function of preventing corruption. Leaven stops being a simple figure of speech and comes to represent a known process of gradual transformation. Daily bread stops sounding like an abstract expression and reveals real dependence on a complete cycle of production and preservation. Barns cease to be just the setting of a parable and become a symbol of food security in a vulnerable society. Food conservation reveals that the world Jesus lived in was structurally fragile. Stability was limited. The margin for error was small. Abundance was temporary. This context helps us understand why themes like provision, trust, prudence, and sharing appear so frequently in the teachings. Because conserving food wasn't just avoiding hunger. It was managing the future. It was dealing with uncertainty. It was balancing prudence and generosity. In a society where the harvest could fail and Roman taxes consumed part of the production, adequate storage could mean the difference between stability and despair. At the same time, hoarding excessively while others suffered scarcity raised real moral dilemmas. Conservation was at the center of this tension. That is why understanding how food was preserved brings us closer to the original context of biblical narratives. We aren't talking about romanticizing the past. We are talking about concrete reality, documented by archaeological excavations, pottery analysis, studies on ancient agricultural practices, and historical records of the Roman period. The world of the first century was technical, practical, and resilient. Spirituality didn't exist separate from material survival. It emerged from it. And perhaps this is the final revelation of this documentary. When we understand how they preserved food, we understand something greater. We understand that the Christian faith was born in an environment where life depended on invisible, silent, and disciplined processes. Conserving food was a daily act, but it was also an act of hope. Hope that tomorrow would come. Hope that the next season would be weathered. Hope that present work would guarantee future sustenance. And this hope structured the language, metaphors, and spiritual understanding of that time. By studying food conservation in the time of Jesus, we aren't just learning ancient techniques. We are recovering the historical texture of the biblical world. We are taking the Gospels out of abstraction and placing them back on the dusty ground of Galilee, among rock-cut silos, sealed jars, salted fish, and sun-dried figs. It is in this real setting that the words were spoken. And it is in this setting that they gain new clarity. If this documentary expanded your historical understanding and brought more depth to your biblical reading, hit the like button right now. This helps the channel reach more people interested in biblical archaeology and ancient history. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming documentaries. Every week, we explore historical aspects of the biblical world based on archaeological evidence and serious contextual analysis. Turn on notifications to be alerted whenever a new study is published. And write in the comments, which detail about food conservation caught your attention the most? The salting of the fish, the underground silos, the fermentation of wine. Your participation strengthens the community and guides future content. Share this video with someone who is interested in historical curiosities and wants to understand the Bible within its original context. See you in the next documentary. Until then, keep investigating, keep questioning, and keep deepening your historical understanding, because history isn't distant, it is preserved.